Those who are new, my name is Naveen Bist. I'm the chair for programs at TIE and a volunteer. So TIE was founded in 1992 with a group of South Asian entrepreneurs, hence the name TIE, the Indus entrepreneur, who wanted to give back to the community. And since then, it's basically a grassroots organization, heavily led by volunteers. In fact, all our co-chairs for the programs to panelists, everyone, volunteers to their time and their intellectual capital, as we call it, to be here. Now, since 1992, since its founding, we have grown into over 60 chapters in 18 countries. And the basic mission of TIE, right from the beginning, has been fostering entrepreneurship. That's what each chapter strives to do, and all the programs and activities in TIE are geared towards that. So some of the new programs we have launched recently are like TIE Launchpad. We just launched an incubator which is focused on enterprise software companies. So they, I think, just finished taking all the applications. So they will be selecting 8 companies which will get seed money of $50,000 plus, mentors associated. And I'll just tell you in a minute the background of the mentors. And then we also have TIE Angels, which provides seed money up to $500,000. And every month, you can go to tiesv.org and apply there. There's a very simple 3-step process. And every month they select 3 companies to present in front of 50 to 60 investors who are mostly charter members. That's one of the constituency of TIE organization, and who invest in those companies. And then we hold, like I said, so one side is this is more providing entrepreneurs with some seed capital and other mentorship, as well as through Launchpad, which is a new initiative. Then we have the programs to inspire, which we have a program called My Story. In fact, we just had it yesterday. It's a monthly program, usually held first Tuesday of every month. And we bring an entrepreneur who has sold his company or exited through going public with over 100 million or so. So like yesterday, we had an entrepreneur who had sold his company recently to Western Digital for 680 million. So they come and share their stories of lessons learned. And then we have these industry-specific programs, like what are the hottest trends and opportunities, what's going on, like this time, for example, today's event, this is about software-defined infrastructure or cloud. So we have a great panel, and in a moment I'll introduce our co-chairs. And then similarly, day before yesterday, we had one on mobile. So we have mobile, big data, SDI, life sciences. These are the various industry-specific programs. And each program we bring, we have these volunteer co-chairs, usually 2, who are again high domain experts and senior executives from the industry. And then, so those are the programs we hold. And TIE constituency, as I was saying, number one, we have these charter members who are highly successful individuals, entrepreneurs, and executives. Number of them are here. Can I see some hands, please, charter members? So a lot of these folks, they've been entrepreneurs, very successful, and they're mentors. Also to any entrepreneurs who want, so please connect with them. And then second group is members. Membership is open to everyone. And it just costs like $150 a year. So it's kind of about $2.50, and you get free food and wine. It's just like cheaper than McDonald's food. I mean, you have about 40 events. It comes about $3. So I think it's a good deal. Well, I'm not getting any commission, okay? I'm also paying my dues too. So and then you get all these great events, you get to network, and then you get inspired, and you might start a company, and later on, you'll be successful. And third constituencies are sponsors. So we have, sponsors are the usual ecosystem, the members of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, I call it. Like you have these law firms, VC firms, CPA, advisory firms like KPMG, Ernst & Young, and as well as large companies like SAP, Microsoft, Google, all these, number of them, sponsors. You might see them on the slide. So with that, what I would like to do is introduce our co-chairs. So like, I have been an entrepreneur myself, and the reason I'm also a volunteer is I started my first product company in '96, and I got seed money just by coming to one of these events from one investor. So which was sold to Novell. We were one of the first security firewall proxy company when Checkpoint had just gone public. So one of the lessons I had learned there was everyone keeps saying, you always go hire A+ people, don't be scared, right? So that's kind of the mantra I have used when I recruit these volunteers. So like I have co-chairs, Kanaya here, VP of Corp Dev at Juniper, and then our another co-chair is Atul, sitting somewhere right there. He's a VP General Manager of Cloud at HP, so you can imagine their background. I don't have to say anything much about it. So then they go recruit even A++ panelists like we have today. See, my job gets even much easier. So I've been using that mantra of how to. So that's a basic mantra. Those who are aspiring entrepreneurs, make sure you get the smartest person in your job will get much easier, even in volunteering. So with that, Kanaya, I would like to introduce Kanaya here. He's going to moderate the session also. He's our co-chair for this SDI along with Atul. Let's give a big round of applause.
Thank you, Naveen. I'm going to invite the panelists up here right now. So if you could just join me, that would be great. So SDI was one of the content tracks that we had focused on this year. So we had a full day at TIECon where we talked about software-defined infrastructure, and we looked at sort of its impact in the networking space, we looked at its impact in storage, and we looked at sort of how that, the overall impact on the manageability of the IT infrastructure. So we did a lot of work there during TIECon. And then later on we did a SIG around software-defined storage a few weeks ago. But if I just fast forward from May until now, I mean, this space is evolving so rapidly. I mean, there's so many things happening in this space that what we talked about at TIECon probably feels like something that happened ages ago. Things that have happened, right? You look at all the different players in the industry, they have all sort of defined what their strategies are. So VMware had acquired Nicira, but that's now integrated in, and they launched their strategy, I think, middle of this year. Juniper had acquired a company called Contrail, and we sort of launched the Contrail product middle of this year, and then we open sourced the product. So, and then IBM, Cisco, Juniper, and some of the other incumbents got together and started Open Daylight. And we have an individual here who's been at the heart of this Open Daylight initiative that we have started. So you look at that SDN space and you say, wow, a lot of stuff has already happened in the last 6 months. Then you look at sort of what is happening in the services part of the infrastructure, and the amount of traction that you see with network function virtualization and virtualizing services in the infrastructure, and the number of startups propping up in that space, right? So that's another interesting area that has evolved quite a bit in the last 6 to 9 months. And then you look at sort of cloud orchestration and the traction that OpenStack is starting to get, and you have a lot of different companies trying to sort of provide that turnkey solution for OpenStack. And we have one of the key players here today on the panel, and they're going to talk about that as well. So a lot has happened. So let's really spend some time talking about some of the changes that are happening in this industry today. I think one overarching theme we found was open source is coming in a big way, right? It's become a big force in how this area evolves. So we thought it would be a great idea to sort of take this evening and really focus in on the role of open source initiatives in the evolution of SDI architecture. So that's what we want to have a discussion around today. And again, we have a very strong panel with very diverse perspectives. So hopefully it'll be an interesting panel today. What I'll do is I'll give you a quick introduction on myself, and then I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves. Instead of me trying to do that, they do a much better job at that. So my background, I run corporate development at Juniper. I have been with Juniper for 7.5 years, 4 years in corp dev, 3 years running the core routing business and the P&L in the core routing business at Juniper. Prior to that, I was GM at a company called Terion. We sold that to Motorola. Before that, at a startup here in the Valley, Lantern Communications. We sold that to Secor. and have been in the networking business for the last 20 plus years. Though this is one of the very exciting times to be in that business. So a lot of change is happening as we speak. With that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and their organization, and take 5 minutes, right, to sort of set the stage for the audience here, and address three things, if you will. One, all this innovation, all the changes that are happening right now, what do you think are the fundamental drivers behind that? Why are we seeing so much activity in the networking space at this point in time? So that's one. Talk a little bit about sort of what is your organization strategy or your perspective on this whole SDI cloud space and how it should evolve. And third, what do you see is the role of open source in that evolution? So if you can just take 5 minutes each and set the stage from your perspective, that'll be a good way to start this, and then I'll throw some questions at each of us, and hopefully that'll start an interesting discussion, and the audience, you will have ample opportunity to ask your questions as well. All right?
Hello, mic check. Hi, I'm Alvin Sequoia. I've been in the Valley quite a long time, since '84, involved with the internet back in '83, '84, DCB networking. I'm a serial entrepreneur, took one company public, sold a couple, the last one to VMware 5+ years ago. I've been involved with networking security, and over the last year, after the acquisition of NISR, I integrated the two organizations, and pretty much have done a lot of work with respect to network virtualization, security virtualization. In terms of where VMware is and our stated strategy, it's actually pretty straightforward. We are preparing for a world that's in the post-PC era, mobile, cloud, replacing client server, replacing a browser server kind of architecture. We're moving to a mobile cloud where the clients are mobile, social, any device, anywhere, and landing on a cloud somewhere, which effectively means a data center somewhere. And from our perspective, since especially in enterprises, we have a large footprint in enterprise data centers. A big part of it is server virtualization has happened in a big way. 80–90% of, actually about 67–70% of the world's workloads in the data centers are already running virtualized, and we expect that number to go to 90% or whatever. And while VMs can be spun up in a matter of seconds, minutes, it's the rest of the data center that's a huge problem, especially networking, security, having to deal with VLAN sprawl, IP, DNS, DHCP, having to deal with configuring your firewalls and load balancers. So that's a matter of weeks and if not months at times, and a lot of manual processes. So a big part of our strategy in the data center evolved from server virtualization to the software-defined data center, and we look at the data center as the cloud layer, the virtual layer, and the physical layer. I think some folks call it the metal ops and VI ops and cloud ops. Those are the three layers. We believe strongly that the virtualization layer is the thing that isolates you from the underlying hardware. Apart from the process, apart from the factors like abstraction and pooling, one important thing that server virtualization did is you can take your workloads and slip in any hardware beneath you without changing the workload. At the same time, you can take the workload and transport it somewhere else without having to worry about things. And the same thing has to happen with network virtualization, etc. It's not about deeper insertion into the network. It's more about abstraction and decoupling, if you will. And so a big part of our strategy with network virtualization, the reason we paid for the NISR acquisition, etc., is to go ahead and completely simplify and rethink networking security, albeit in the context of cloud operations, agility, efficiency in the data center. And that's why it's a big part of our strategy for private clouds and hybrid clouds, which is effectively the same experience, albeit in someone else's CapEx, if you will.
Yeah.
So I'm Vijay Pandey. I'm the CTO for Network OS in IBM. I run the architecture team for networking within IBM. I came in through an acquisition of a company called Blade Network Technologies around 3 years ago. And I've been in networking as far as I can remember. But since the acquisition into IBM, networking has been a piece of the puzzle, but it's all been applications and cloud and how to deliver all of that and how networking fits into the big picture. From the IBM perspective, the whole problem that IBM is trying to solve is twofold. One is for off-the-shelf applications, like say you're deploying an Exchange server or you're deploying SharePoint or a three-tiered app, enterprise app. How do we get from conceptualizing the app to actually deploying it on the physical environment in as little time as possible? So that is the whole notion behind figuring out what the application pattern is, converting it to a software pattern, converting it to infrastructure patterns, and then finally deploying it onto the infrastructure. And that cycle has to be as short as possible. So that's one aspect of it, that's pre-configured software that you would buy from a software company like IBM or Microsoft. The other aspect is this whole notion of born in the cloud applications. So things which you cannot buy from a vendor like IBM, but you would buy piece parts from a vendor and you would write your own. So like a fraud detection application that you won't get from anybody, but you would get a big data appliance from IBM and you would use that with your own code and build something out of it. Or you might want to use some Amazon Web Services and create an application that you want. So in those kinds of applications, how do you guarantee any kind of service level agreement? That's the other aspect, because the infrastructure is highly shared, you have no control over what the application looks like, but the end customer still is expecting a certain kind of guarantee on the infrastructure. So for both of these use cases, there is this whole notion of a software-defined infrastructure that will allow you to guarantee some sort of service levels based on whether you buy it prepackaged or whether you deploy it from scratch. In terms of, I think you had asked another question around open source.
Yeah.
I mean, IBM is a big believer in open source for a multitude of reasons. We've done it multiple times in Linux, whether it's Linux, Eclipse, a whole bunch of other places. We are a big supporter of OpenStack, so a lot of our orchestration strategy is built around OpenStack. And in terms of SDN, we are a big believer in Open Daylight, so a lot of the strategy in SDN will be based around Open Daylight. So we will be supporting both of those and a whole bunch of other open source projects too in our products when we come out with those products.
Thanks. So, a little different background than the guys over here. I actually think there's a good split. We have the networking experts and we have the OpenStack on this side of the table. So, I am Matt Bradley. I work at Rackspace. I started at Rackspace in 2009, so almost 5 years ago. And most recently, actually, was CFO of one of our business units, and have since transitioned to leading our M&A strategy and our deep product partnership strategy. So that's a little background on me, and then around Rackspace and what we're doing. So we are running the world's largest OpenStack-based cloud, and when we think about the offer that we deliver, it's really, some of you may have heard this, but we call it fanatical support, and that is our core differentiator, and that's at the OS level, at the DevOps level, or at the app level. We want to have proactive and reactive capabilities to ensure that our customers are running the right architecture and are solving the business problems that matter to them. And so that is at our core what our premise is. And then we deliver that through really open technologies, like I said, based on OpenStack, but a number of other things. So we have a MongoDB offer, which is in many ways open source. And then the other component beyond being an open focused company, and that goes beyond the technologies that we support, but also our belief in vendor lock-in and no vendor lock-in, really. And so for us, OpenStack means that if we're not doing a good job for you as a service provider, you can go to IBM or you can go to HP. And that's important to a lot of our customers, because at the end of the day, if we're not providing good service, you shouldn't come to us. And then the second thing, other than open technologies, is a hybrid story. And so we have a public cloud offer, but we also have, and we'll talk about this later, we have a private cloud offer, which is private cloud hosted in our data center or private cloud hosted on premise. And we believe that our ability to couple a public offer with a private offer is pretty powerful, and it's one that not everyone in the marketplace is doing, and it really differentiates our offer. So that's it.
It's amazing we have this whole accumulated pile of microphones here. I'll have two. You can have one. You guys, thank you for speaking because you're never going to get a mic back. I'm kidding. My name's Joshua McKenty. I'm the co-founder and CTO at Piston Cloud Computing. On the open source side, I guess I have the distinction of being the first one to publish OpenStack as open source. It was on my blog in May of 2010. Before it was called OpenStack, it was called Nova, and it didn't have the storage components. It was before the Rackspace partnership. So I was running an engineering team at NASA there. Before that, I did open source. I was a technical lead at Netscape for a while, did a couple of editions of the Netscape browser, I worked at Flock. So I've worked at 2 different companies that fought over the same open source code base twice in my career. I think just you sort of asked us to lay groundwork. I think we're 50 years into a 400-year transition into what open source will end up looking like. So I think when people say, well, open source means your business model is X, that's a little bit like at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution when people said, well, factories mean you're using steam power. And if you're not using steam power, it's not a factory. It was before the invention of the treadmill. So I think we have a long way to go in terms of understanding what open source is and what it means from a business perspective. We do open core at Piston, which means we sell OpenStack along with proprietary software that we wrote that we think gives you a more usable environment. But our commitment to no vendor lock-in. I'm also the co-chair of the OpenStack Foundation Board Interoperability Committee, which means I'm right now in charge of defining what OpenStack means, which is confusing. But we don't ever touch the OpenStack APIs except as contribution to open source. So we built a lot of things around master election and high availability and scale out that we think are important in our product. But if we touch OpenStack, it's always as a contribution. The driver, and this, it's funny, I'm not a networking guy. I have no training. Actually, I never went to college anyway, but even if I had, I didn't study networking. But I realized as I was sitting here getting ready to answer this question, I wrote the most widely deployed OpenStack SDN ever, which is Nova Network. So, and I wrote it in a day and a half originally, and it's horrible. And it's more than 70% of all OpenStack deployments use that. So I think I do have some unique perspective on what actually works in SDN. And the design goal when we worked on that was an understanding of a thing called the mobility gap, which is as we go into the future of computing, how many of you have heard of Moore's Law? Pretty common, okay? So computers get faster every year, roughly. The price performance curve is logarithmic, and it's about every 18 months. They're about double for the same cost. There's a very similar curve that's called Kreider's law, which is improvements in storage density. So we can produce data by computing it, we can store data, and the last curve is called Nielsen's law, which is improvements in network performance. It doesn't keep up to the first two. So the farther we get into the future, in fact, every day, we are more and more dominated by our inability to move data around. So the entire big data movement is driven by this problem, which is you gotta move your compute to the storage because doing it the other way around doesn't work. So a lot of the focus on agile networks and software-defined networks or smart networks or DevOps approach to all infrastructure is driven by the fact that the application designers can't ignore networking like they were able to for decades. So that, from my perspective, is why we had to deal with networking. And it's what ended up causing us to write Nova Network originally. And yeah, from a business standpoint, I have partnerships with almost everyone on the stage on the networking side, except for Matt. Go ahead.
Sure, thanks. I'm Akshay Sharma. I'm a Gartner analyst, former CTO of a smartphone startup and chief architect at Siemens Mobile on the packet core. Been an entrepreneur. One startup was part of Tellogics, part of IBM. Another one was part of Wind River, which then is now part of Intel, ex-Nortel. That's my networking background. And I'm the analyst who covers SDN and network functions virtualization from a carrier cloud perspective at Gartner. One of my coworkers is Sri Chaturvedi as well, part of Gartner Consulting. The perspectives on SDN that I've seen as an analyst is multifaceted. So I've seen things from the enterprise, but also from the telco cloud. So the Verizon Terramarks of the world, or the CenturyLink Savises of the world. They come from more of a carrier grade heritage, so just having things on the cloud servers, just hosting, well, that doesn't mean it's carrier grade. That doesn't mean it's 5 nines reliable. I mean, we've already had outages with Amazon AWS a year ago with Netflix and things like that. So how do you get that engineering aspects of 5 nines with stateful replication of, geo-redundant kind of solutions? That's one aura that needs to be addressed. We've also seen SDN applied to the transport network. Tunable optics, wavelengths on the fly, bandwidth on demand, latency being controlled, resiliency being controlled. And so that's more of a, how do you connect? How do you go from 1 gig to 10 gig? How do you go from 10 gigabit per second to 40 gig or to 100 gigabit per second on demand? And we're starting to see that as a requirement. Maybe an enterprise doesn't need a 100 gigabit per second pipe all the time. Maybe you just want to pay 10 gig. And then during bursty traffic needs, SDN provision it on the fly. What about network functions virtualization? Right now, I was just at Gartner Symposium, our big flagship event, 15,000 people show up at Orlando a month ago. And I did a bunch of one-on-ones with CTOs and CIOs of small real estate investment trusts, banks, hospitals, all the way to the CTO of Lockheed Martin and companies in between. And one of the common themes I got out of it was CTOs and CIOs are tired of buying boxes. They're tired of hiring staff, managing it, maintaining it, and then doing interop testing, and then 2 years later, repeating the whole process again. They want someone else to manage it for them. They want someone else to maintain it. They want someone else to have it as a service that you pay as you grow. And so that's the idea of NFV, where functions that used to be in a box, like a session border controller, a NAT, a firewall, maybe an IPPBX, whatever those functions are now hosted in the cloud. And we're starting to see more and more of these boxes being virtualized in the cloud, and then be service chained or service orchestrated on a pay-as-you-grow kind of basis. There's going to be newer revenue share models with equipment vendors from the carriers. So they may make money, and then they pay the equipment vendor perhaps a percentage of that revenue. We're going to see flatter OSSs and BSSs. The operational support systems and the business support systems might become more flatter, policy charging rules functions, with policy embedded, configurations embedded, and charging as you grow. Not the subscription models of the past, where you buy a lease line, a T1, or a gig or a 10 gig. Now it's burstable. Now you just buy bandwidth and then you pay it as you need it. So this might lead to newer services that we haven't even thought of, like cloud bursting, being able to atomically transact storage, compute, and network resources as an elastic resource on an on-demand kind of basis. So we might see new services come out. And now on the open source concept, I might be the lone person that might be taking an opposite view. I believe in open APIs, definitely. But I think open source can also be a hacker's dream. I can see vulnerabilities inside the code. I can then address those vulnerabilities. An SDN controller that holistically controls the entire network, I can then holistically hack the entire network as well. And so I think, while open source allows for innovation and maybe better interoperability between the vendors, I still believe in closed systems to get to production quality type solutions. And then I think vendors still need some areas to innovate. Maybe you open source and have a baseline, where things are interoperable, but then you have to innovate on top and have some value-add tech solutions as well.
All right, thank you. I think this is a great setup. Let me actually, since you raised this open source issue, let me have the panel, if anyone's interested in responding to that. I'm sure there are perspectives here.
So I think OpenBSD is supposed to be the most secure platform out there. It's completely open sourced. And every hacker can look at that line of code forever, and they still haven't managed to break it. So I don't think that's a fair statement to make, that just because it's open, it's less secure. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect around innovation, I think the industry as a whole has grown a little bit around how to tackle open source. So instead of, I'm going to go out on a limb and say there are multiple licenses to open source, and if you choose the right license, you can enable both open source growth as well as innovation around it. So, for example, the EPL or the BSD style license, Apache style license. These are licenses that allow you to play in the open source domain as well as innovate within it and around it, and not get contaminated and provide value to your customers as a corporation.
This is perhaps an OpenStack-centric view. I think there's a famous, I believe it's a Linus Torvalds quote, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. But I think, again, it's not about the source code, it's about the commit process. And so I think OpenStack is the first open source community that has 0 committers. Since nobody has commit privileges to the code base, every piece of software has gone through code review by at least 2 members of the core team. And we've never broken that rule, even when the gate's been stuck, right? So we had, that dramatically changes the quality of the code base. And code quality is where security comes in. And you can have very poor code quality in closed source software. I have worked on very large closed source software systems that are horrendously bad. And I've worked on large open source systems that are horrendously bad. Mozilla, kind of horrendously bad in spots. Despite being open source, because of the commit process, because of who's allowed to commit and who can just commit because they want to versus whether or not it takes a code review.
Yeah, our perspective on open source, I'm a little less concerned on the security aspects as much as the governance, the direction, the roadmaps, and some of the rhetoric going on these days actually hits upon a key issue. Who is in charge of the agenda? Where are we headed? What drives us? What are we trying to be when we grow? Is there a certain set of an identity crisis? Because I can tell you this, working where we are with virtualization and clouds, we are now almost to a point, as we said, where hardware takes a back seat and the new virtualization layers or cloud layers start becoming the x86 of the future. Everything is being built on top of it. So we have a tremendous responsibility and onus. And I can tell you, going through system testing and all the last 3, 4, 5 months of bringing out major releases, whether you're at a Microsoft or a VMware, where there are millions of lines of code and getting that to work all day round the clock. Who takes that ownership? Who stresses the system out so that our customers can sleep at night? So those are things that worry me. Is this driven by collaborators? Is this driven by the vendors with sponsors? Is this driven by customer needs and who chooses which, what, where? I think those are some of my bigger concerns. All of them are reconcilable issues to be sure, but I love the model of having a benevolent dictator kind of an organization controlling open source, because as bad as that is, some of the best open source projects out there have had a benevolent dictator or a small team that really owned it and were passionate about it versus letting it loose.
Yes. One thing I would just add there, I think if you look at how markets have evolved, and whether it's iOS and Android, or Solaris and Linux, or AWS and VMware and OpenStack, I think that what we've seen evolve, and I think it's hard to argue against this, is there's a proprietary winner and there is an open standard. And I think that that will continue, certainly in the cloud operating system world, And you know, it's one where actually I think the open standard is much harder to disrupt because you don't have a vendor, a single vendor in many ways that has 80% market share or something like that, where they get greedy, and that causes opportunity for competitors. So,
If I may counter that, I mean, I agree with the Unix BSD kind of analogy. However, not everything is open. I mean, trying to get a Kerberos algorithm for security for 256-bit encryption, those algorithms, some of those are still lockstep. I mean, they're proprietary. You can't just open source everything because guess what? The government will have something to say. So I agree in principle, but there's certain things that somehow have to be kept guarded as well.
So you want to add something?
Yeah, the last note on the security side, I was going to wait and see if someone else will bring it up. The bigger issue then, is there a CVE, is there a vulnerability identified, is what's the mean time to resolution? How long is that vulnerability open? And the nice thing about a larger open source community is that, again, you can turn to a community of thousands of committers, of contributors, and say, hey, we need a patch for this now. Average resolution time for OpenStack CVEs is really short, and we've had only a couple of public disclosure problems in the first year. So.
But on that same topic, actually, having done security for a while, it turns out that time to resolution is very important, but in fact, most organizations don't patch in time. Time to patch turns out, I can tell you this, with all the CVs out there, the number of organizations that have not patched stuff, you can go with existing well-known things for which patches are available, and a hacker who's after something will always find organizations, almost every organization, even the best organization will unpatch. So time to patch, I think, is a much bigger important metric than even time to resolve.
I'll give you the 20 later on for having brought that up, because you just threw me a softball. That's the number one thing that we built our proprietary software around, is the ability to do an upgrade in place without turning it off. Because that's the reason people don't patch, because you can't get downtime.
Makes sense. So I think there's questions around ownership, there's questions around throat to choke when you actually deploy an open source based solution. So those are the things that proprietary solutions based off of open source can bring to bear. And the innovation that the community can bring to bear sort of is all the positives that we can get out of that. So speaking of open source and the variety of different solutions, now pivot this question to more of the network infrastructure layer, and really sort of ask the audience here, right? When we talk about the networking layer, we talk about the SDN controller. That's the virtualization layer in the layer that's going to virtualize the physical infrastructure. Do we have just way too many options out there? I mean, you have Juniper, you have VMware, you have Cisco, you have Big Switch, you have Open Daylight, you have Open Contrail. Are we just inadvertently slowing down the adoption of a common virtualization layer in networking? Are we our own worst enemies here, or what are your thoughts?
I could take that. I think, first of all, the word SDN is bandied around pretty loosely. Martin Casado in this era was one of the first people associated with the term SDN, and we are walking away from that term because is SDN controller an open flow controller? Is it a controller of open flow switches? Is it in fact something that controls the fabric, like an NCME controller or an Arista controller or a Juniper controller like Contrail? Or is it something different? So what we've done is we think at each layer in the stack, the network needs are slightly different. At the physical layer, it's a good thing that networking vendors have woken up and gotten away from device-specific CLIs and moved into an SDN controller, which is synonymous with fabric controllers. In that context, it's mostly software-defined, software programmable networks is the way I look at it. Open flow switching, in my estimate, is a non-starter in data centers. It's pretty widely relevant for the WAN, but it's irrelevant in the data center because data center architectures, I think, are evolving to a point where you're simplifying it. It's high speed, 10, 40 gigs, leaf and spine, or as Arista calls them, splines, and it's L3 ECMP to the rack maybe even all the way to the virtual switch, with ECMP giving you the fatness and leverage on the network. So I think the SDN controller term and all these 3, 4, 5 things being bandied over, the SDN controller does not network virtualization make. What network virtualization is very critical about to plug into OpenStack upstairs or vCloud is about abstracting and pooling. And SDN controllers do not give you that. They give you programmability, and there's still a distance between that and what's needed by the applications above. So at least that's my perspective. So every variant of SDN controller out there is slightly different, doing something very different. The Nuage controller, the Contrail controller, the Daylight controller, the InCME controller, the VMware controller, etc. These are 10 different beasts, and they're never to be equated.
So I'd like to jump on that because being the open daylight proponent here, you are right. I mean, there are controllers out there which tackle one aspect of network, say network virtualization or OpenFlow, or it's just an easier way to configure the network, and it's just a shim layer like a TAILF kind of thing, which is just a shim layer to configure your devices. So everything is being thrown in the bucket of SDN and SDN controller. And in a way, that's okay, because there are various levels of abstractions in a network that you need to deal with. And network virtualization in the sense of overlays has its place. OpenFlow has its place. There are certain specific applications that you can do with OpenFlow in a much simpler way that you can't do using regular N2N3. Most networks in data centers are going to be layer 2, layer 3, so that has its place. So for all of these various kinds of technologies, they all have their sweet spot, they all have their use cases, and you need a controller, you need an OS which actually takes all of those different technologies and provides one abstraction layer. And that could be an OpenStack, that could be an Open Daylight. I'm not arguing where it should be. In my opinion, I think there is certain benefit around layering these pieces of software, so you can't be putting everything in OpenStack. I think the OpenStack Neutron plugins or the heat abstractions are there for a certain reason, and they shouldn't be made complicated enough. I think a controller like Open Daylight, which allows for different plugins like device drivers to deal with different technologies, different parts of the network in the data center or the WAN, and presents an abstract interface going up to OpenStack is the right approach to take. One more thing to add before I forget. I mean, I think to your point around are we hurting ourselves by doing this? In a way, I think we are as an industry by having so many open consortiums and open source activities around just a simple piece like SDN. I mean, in the broader sense, it's just one part of the data center equation. But on the other hand, I think time will tell what happens to these initiatives. And I think going back to what Matt had said earlier, at one point, there was Microsoft in the server space, there was Solaris, there was AIX, there was HPUX, there was a whole bunch of OSs that you could run on your server. And when Linux came about, there were only two. There was Microsoft and there was Linux. I think over time we will see one closed source, like you said, Matt, and one open source alternative to an SDN controller space. And at least I would like to believe that's open data, but that's my opinion.
Akshay, you had something to add?
Sure. In fact, I asked a question to a Verizon executive, how many SDN controllers do they have in the lab? And this was at their Verizon analyst event at the Terramark facility back in June. And they said 22 SDN. And you mentioned some companies, Big Switch, of course, Juniper, Alcatel, Lucent, Nuage, Cisco, Plexi, the whole list goes on. And then I asked, so when are you going to decide? And they said probably 6 months to a year. And then his answer was probably select 2, maybe 3 vendors. So that means 19 perhaps will be unhappy at the end of the day. So, but he did say there could be a reason to have federation. You may have multiple controllers. I mean, right now we have a session border controller for voice over IP. We have a hotspot 2.0, service provider Wi-Fi controller in the mobile packet core. So you could be doing a voice over IP call and walking in and out of a hotspot and you have two controllers controlling that session, one for the hotspot Wi-Fi and one for your voice quality. And so I think there's going to be a notion of federated controllers where you may have parts of control being controlled by one element and maybe other parts being controlled by something else.
That's a good point, yeah. So there might be a peaceful coexistence here, but the number of players might still be shrinking, right? You have
So,
something
so
else to say?
the open source, OpenStack guys are gonna pipe in. This is the part where I never get invited back to the same panel, and it's because I'm usually incredibly rude. So this is the part where I'm going, I hate you all. The #1 deployed SDN controller for OpenStack is Nova Network. I wrote it. It's a piece of crap, but you know what? Not a single one of those 22 SDN controllers has feature parity. Not one. Neutron is going to fail because nobody can be bothered to finish their product. Because they want to argue over layer 5 through 7 magic things we will do in the future, or some feature that nobody even thinks they need yet. We don't have HA/DHCP. We don't have basic HA routing. They're like, give me a layer 2 network and an IP address for my VM. At a minimum, maybe some ACLs would be nice. Maybe just the stuff I can do already with my basic physical switch as a virtual function, and we could deploy that. And then we can argue about the rest of
But
it.
Josh, therein lies the rub on Nova networking is incredibly simplistic, right? VLAN.
Yes.
And it's not multi-vendor, it's not multi-plugin, and all the vendors have crept in at once, all of them seeking the turf. So you should have let it go a little later after having prescriptively defined an interface before the vendors crept in. I think this is where we need a benevolent dictator outside of the vendors, especially the incumbent vendors, because right now it's a land grab for taking piece of that turf and asserting control. And invariably what the vendors will do is try to verticalize, when the beauty about OpenStack is the horizontal replaceability. So every single networking vendor, make no mistake, is trying to go straight through from Nova networking into the hardware and put in place proprietary mechanisms to lock you in. We got to prevent that, put in a plugin, establish some small set of folks whose job it is to see that does not happen, but advance Nova networking to a point where that can happen in a prescriptive fashion. And I think that's needed, else it will fail.
And I think the thing is, the abstraction that you provide at Nova Network is good. But in the end, you have to translate that to the various networking technologies that sit below, right? So you are not doing that in OpenStack. And I agree, there is a role for that level of abstraction, but there is something that sits below that needs to provide that abstraction. And if you don't do that, if you don't have a horizontal play at that level, then you get into the problem that Alvin was talking about, which is you get the straight pass-through from a vendor all the way to OpenStack, which is not the way we want to go. So we need an abstraction layer, again, bringing Open Daylight into the picture. That is the abstraction layer that takes, whether it's vendor-specific, whether it's L2, L3, open flow, overlays, doesn't matter. It abstracts all of that out so that it can plug into the Nova network.
Can we ask the moderator, as the Juniper guy, what's your opinion of Open Daylight?
We are, along with IBM and several others, a supporter of Open Daylight. Now, I think the starting point of what is in Open Daylight, right, the technology that is the starting point, that could be something that is debatable. But I think
Exactly.
the fundamental premise of what Open Daylight is looking to achieve, we are fully behind that, right? I think there is a need for a virtualization layer that has the right APIs, northbound to OpenStack, and southbound, the variety of different interfaces going into a Juniper, Arista, whatever other physical infrastructure switch there is, right? And I think most players would agree that you're not going to make money selling SDN controllers. That's not where the money is. It's basically the virtualization layer that then lets you do a whole bunch of interesting things from an application and services perspective. So I think if we were to pool our energies behind a common controller, I think that that would serve the industry well. Now, the devil is always in the details, in the operational aspects of pulling off that, and that's where We stand, that's the status right now on Open Daylight. It remains to be seen, right? I mean, the traction we get there. So, you want to add something there?
I'm just gonna, I'll give a little plug to our VMware friends over here. So I think for us, we run, as I said earlier, a very large OpenStack-based public cloud, and a key part of that for us is actually Nicira. And so, they've worked with us along the way, and listen, it's not easy. The reason that this debate is happening, I think, is actually because this problem is a very hard one to solve. And it's one where us as a service provider, historically in the old world, massive multi-tenancy and security were inversely related. And we want to get to a world where we can put as really a vendor, a Fortune 500 customer next to a startup in Soma. We want to deploy it right away, provision it right away, and that's what's hard. It's very hard.
No, that is exactly the point. I mean, we have been seriously involved with some installation with some of the largest companies in the world, seriously interested in deploying, 100,000, 200,000 VMs all on OpenStack. And there's always a little hitch somewhere along the way, and that cannot be gainsaid. This is why we owe it to ourselves. We're going to be serious about making it successful, and we're trying. From VMware's perspective, the myriad of stacks is just fine, because most of our customers, we have 400,000, 500,000 customers, large pockets of them have VMware, vSphere installations, but a lot of them are interested in OpenStack, and we are looking to the canonical data center of the future, multiple racks of vSphere, but KVM, Linux, workloads, new state of apps, and so the data center of the future, the canonical scale out. Let's talk about 1 million VMs with 10 pods, each pod 10 racks, each rack, some have 50 servers with 20 VMs. That's how you get to 1 million VMs. Trying to get that done right and done in a heterogeneous fashion where KVM or bare metal Linux workloads next to vSphere workloads, all provisionable on the fly, where your L3s can, where your VMs can cross. You remove all the boundaries of VLAN, avoid the VLAN sprawl, firewall sprawl. That's not an easy problem by any means, and it all sounds good in your first rack, your second rack, but by the time you start hitting the 10 rack pod boundaries and you start going north-south and all, there's a lot of serious issues that take place. And just when people are beginning to get excited about the deployment is where it begins to fall apart. And that's why this is something that we have seriously taken into consideration.
So let me I'm going to pivot this to OpenStack in a second, but let me ask and give Vijay an opportunity to address this question. Right? I think one of the common sort of things you might hear, right, criticisms of Open Daylight is, hey, is this incumbents trying to stall the industry while they come up with their own solutions, right? And I know it is not. So why don't you address sort of that common question that keeps coming up, right?
Sure, and I think that's the beauty of open source, right? So the provenance of the code that came into being initially is never, by the time you're into the second or third year of the consortium or the open source project, it's basically the community taking over. And we see that already. I welcome all of you to go to the wiki page for Open Daylight and check out all the projects that are being proposed. And you will see maybe, and I'll be blatant here, we are talking about Cisco, right? And I'll be blatant here, the base controller, parts of it came from Cisco, but if you look at all the projects being done there, there are university people, there are small companies, there are large companies, there are individual contributors, all of them have proposed projects and are growing their community as we speak. And this is within 6 months of, 6 to 8 months of this being formed. All of these things take a little while. In OpenStack, we are on the 8th release stage, right? And it's still, to be honest, it's not prime time. So by the time an Open Daylight like controller becomes prime time, maybe 2 years down the line, where everything is solid and the open source version of it can be deployed in mission critical applications, say maybe a year or a year and a half, I think it'll look very, very different from what it started out with. And it will have no resemblance to what the original code base used to look like.
All right, great. So let's pivot the discussion to OpenStack. And maybe Josh, you can sort of kick this off and then the other panelists can join in. What do you think were the big drivers behind OpenStack, the OpenStack movement? Was it because you had the vendor locked solutions that were just too expensive, or was it people needed solutions to sort of bridge the gap between private and public cloud, sort of have a hybrid cloud offering? What do you think was the big sort of driver behind OpenStack?
So I gave a speech on this in Paris. It was super fun, and so a lot of this is kind of top of mind. But to get a community to coalesce around an idea, the most important thing is you just all have to agree on what the idea is. And so in a lot of ways, OpenStack was successful because the idea was pretty dumb. And it's not a complicated idea. It's like, oh, well, we'll just do like AWS open source, or we'll do Rackspace Cloud open source. And the nature of how the project was set up was it made it very easy for people to bring their own projects to it. OpenStack went really broad really quickly. So that was easy. That was, as a community, it was easy for people to bring their own opinions and be like, well, what I really want to work on is block storage. Let's have a new project that's block storage. And so we had 6 vendors come together around block storage. Part of it was vendors. Part of it was an enormous ecosystem of vendors. I mean, there's 180 licensees of the trademark now, I think, who needed a cloud story, and they knew that just taking what they had and calling it cloud wasn't really going to be good enough. And I think Matt is probably in a better position. I mean, Rackspace really did all of the heavy lifting in terms of building community of, the name. It's important to have a great name. The original governance model, and the fact that we were willing to change it. The original governance model was me and Jesse from NASA, and Jim Curry and Jonathan Bryce from Rackspace. It was the 4 of us, we were the governance board. That lasted for like 6 weeks, I think. Like, okay, now there are too many people involved, they feel like they want to have a voice, let's change it, let's have some elected seats. So the willingness to change, a lot of what the users didn't like in the first year, the community really needed, which was that we were totally flexible to figuring out what we were doing. Okay, well, how are we gonna organize teams? What's the definition of a core team? What are the responsibilities? How do people get onto a core team? How do you get people off the core team? It's ironic, myself and my co-founder were the first 2 people, and Jesse Andrews, the first 3 people ever removed from a core team. Because we just, the role of being in governance means we stopped doing code reviews. And the rest of the core team was like, you're not doing the reviews, you're out of here. So that willingness to invent what we were doing, I think, was what made it successful. The vendor demand brought a lot of people who were paid to work on it. But there were 2 kinds of unfulfilled need. There was the unfulfilled need of the people who were saying, hey, we need a cloud that we can use, that we can trust, we could bring in-house if we had to. And AWS isn't that. And VMware, I think at the time, had the reverse problem, which was you could have VMware in-house, but the VMware service providers, with the exception of Rackspace, weren't that good. So there wasn't really this feeling there was a giant ecosystem of folks, and this is part of, I think, why VMware ended up operating their own cloud. And the parity wasn't there. But there was also a pent-up desire to have a new and exciting open source story. I think this one people don't really latch onto. We had Linux, and Linux got old eventually, and it wasn't exciting, and it wasn't great for your resume to say, I'm a contributor to Linux. Be like, oh, who cares? Everybody is a contributor to Linux now. And Mozilla, the same thing. It was cool for a while to be a contributor to Mozilla or Firefox or Flock or something, and then that wasn't really very cool. And SourceForge and GitHub had been so broad, it was like everybody had an open source project, and everyone got excited about being involved in open source, but most of those were so tiny, they didn't have this feeling of community. And I think there was this huge pent-up desire for people like, we want to feel like we're part of a big open source thing. What's the big open source thing that we can be part of?
So Matt, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I think, as Josh said, so we founded OpenStack, and even today, years later, we're still the #1 contributor in terms of lines of code, and you know these stats better than me because you sit on the board foundation. But I think it would be easy to sit back and say, man, we knew this was coming, and this was so easy, but I think to Josh's point, building a community is really hard. And for us, I think, there were a number of things that were important early on. I think Josh touched on the open source story, and it's really about, for us, it's no vendor lock-in. It goes back to you want to run it on Rackspace? Sure, great. But if we're not doing a good job, there's plenty of other people that can run these infrastructures or these applications. And so the no vendor lock-in was big. I think the open source story just generally was pretty big. And then I think there was, we sort of created this flywheel effect where, we'll call it free software in many ways because we were giving it away for free. Free software creates an ecosystem, which then creates vendors and partners, and then all of a sudden it has become about much more than, is it an alternative to VMware or AWS because it's cheap? No, it's actually because it is solving the business need that our customers want, and it is, whether it's a high performance workload or it is, something at the API layer, or whether it's a web app, we can put OpenStack on it and ensure that you're getting the right performance for the right workload for the right dollar. And that's where OpenStack has gone. And then it's also become, as part of that right workload, it's become a hybrid story for us, which is very powerful. It's something that we intend to do and do well. And OpenStack has created that opportunity for us.
Any other thoughts from other panelists?
Yeah, I think the other thing is, if you look at IBM's perspective on OpenStack, we are heavily invested in OpenStack as well. And very selfishly, one of the things that it provides a whole base of not committers, wrong word to use, but a community of developers that are developing this platform that you can use, piece parts or as a whole, in your product. So I like to say that IBM, the business model of IBM around OpenStack is with it, in it, and around it. All three are valid. We can take OpenStack, like Matt was saying, and provide the services and support around it. That's GTS for us. That's a valid business model. We actually take piece parts of OpenStack and actually use it in our products. So there's a whole push towards our Tivoli products using OpenStack code, our smart cloud products using OpenStack code, and then actually in it. So even providing, so we have this platform computing acquisition that happened 2 years ago. We're actually taking parts of it and actually bringing it back into OpenStack. We're going to deliver piece parts to it into OpenStack, but also use it as a product. So there are various ways of innovating around open source or building a business model around open source. And we are into all three of those.
So one of the common challenges that comes up or questions that comes up is is it just too complex to have to sort of pull together an OpenStack based deployment because you're stitching together piece parts from different open source components, right? So
Yes.
talk about that.
Yes. There's a common misperception, and it's plagued us. The comparison to Linux is so popular because people are like, oh, it's a giant open source project, and it has this colorful history and all of these big commercial partners. OpenStack is not at all like Linux. OpenStack is like kernel.org. So it is not the whole thing of what a cloud takes to run. And there are very simple examples of that. And we're going through this right now in the interoperability committee process of saying what are actually the core pieces that constitute something that's allowed to say it's OpenStack. It is very likely that at least a few of those will be Nova, so you've got to have some way of launching virtual machines. Nova does not include the hypervisor. It includes drivers for 6 or 7 hypervisors. The hypervisor is not part of OpenStack. You have to choose. The hypervisor you choose limits all of your other choices. Not all of the network models work with all of the hypervisors. Not all of the storage backends work with all of the hypervisors. Then you pick a storage backend, and again, there are drivers for a bunch of different ones, and your range of choices around snapshotting options changes. What kind of snapshots can you do? Are they sparse? Are they thinly provisioned? And this is before we even touch networking. Then you make networking. So the way that most people consume OpenStack is by buying a product that is built on, it might be Smart Cloud Orchestrator, it might be Piston OpenStack, it might be RDO from Red Hat, it might be, I mean, there are a bunch of vendors now. The vendors are in a whole ecosystem from the service providers, Mirantis, a little bit of cloud scaling, who will help you take the raw open source and set it up. And down through folks like Piston, who only do software, to Nebula and Morph Labs, who sell hardware appliances, to IBM and HP and Dell, who sell you sort of turnkey hardware and software and services.
Yeah, I think OpenStack, we are involved with some of the largest OpenStack deployments at eBay, PayPal, Rackspace, and all. For example, and standing up OpenStack is one piece, but bringing that into operational environments and trying to meet the needs of such organizations and all, there's a big distance, and it is true today that most organizations that are serious about OpenStack have to truly have developers on staff versus many other things you bring into a data center and IT. Rackspace has a lot of developers, eBay has a lot of developers, PayPal has a lot of developers to cover the gap from what is prepackaged and available from the OpenStack community versus having.
I mean, it depends on whether they're going with a product or they're going. If they're going raw open source, they need a team in house that represents what they would be getting in a product.
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
And therein lies the big difference. Many IT shops, I mean, this is a new model. It's more DevOps like versus their classic IT deployers, if you will. And so the further away you go from a DevOps mentality and classic IT becomes a harder and harder problem. So those are things I think over Havana and Grizzly and all that, that's where the evolution has to take it and narrow the gap so that...
Now this becomes controversial because most of the OpenStack community disagrees with you. They don't think that installers have any place in OpenStack. And the challenge is, at the API layer, OpenStack needs to solve all problems for all clouds. Right? The goal of interop is very specifically that hybrid cloud has to work.
See, I think that's a mistake. I do think that's a mistake. Because for us, most of our Nistar deployments, we are hundreds of deployments and all out there. We spend too much energy trying to just get the OpenStack up to work. I think it's worthwhile the OpenStack organization. DevStack turns out to be the popular starting point for that very reason, right? So there are these things. I mean, installers are not a sexy thing for most collaborators, but it's an important thing for most of the consumers if you want to...
The problem is the installer bakes you into an architecture that is not necessarily fit for purpose. And if you go from the difference between what the service provider and telcos are looking for their POPs to what the large Rackspace style clouds are looking to do versus, I mean, we support remote lights out data centers in 5 countries running OpenStack where nobody's been in the data center in more than a year. That's a totally different deployment approach than a Rackspace data center where you've got 20 or 30 people in the room all the time. So if you bake the installer into the community, you are limiting the scope of what OpenStack can be applied to.
And I think it's the whole question around whether you're building a product, an open source product, or it's an open source framework. And I think that decision has to be made, and that needs to be carried on throughout the life cycle of the product.
I mean, it's been made. It was made before we launched.
Exactly.
It was made over again. It's
Right.
being made over again in core. I'm sorry that we're going to disappoint you again.
No, trust me, it's okay. So, keep rocking. You're missing an opportunity, is all I can say.
So deployments, right? Talk a little bit about the deployments, either on the at the network infrastructure layer, sort of in the SDN controller space, or in the OpenStack space, or in the NFV space. And maybe Akshay, if you've seen something from an industry analyst perspective, right? What do you see? Where do you see? Are we getting traction here?
So we're starting to see the tunability of the optical layer. So for example, BT OpenReach, you can buy tunable wavelengths on demand with, in their case, it's Sienna equipment. I believe they also have ADVA, which is one of the Juniper partners as well. We're starting to see Time Warner Telecom as an example of doing this tunable idea. Verizon has equipment from Sienna in the lab. They're looking for a second source. I mentioned the SDN controllers in the lab as well, but eventually that's going to get baked in. We've seen the NFV concept at the other end of the spectrum. So a session border controller I mentioned. So I know Juniper, you made a partnership with Sonos, for example, where the Sonos SBC was turned into a hypervisor-based application and orchestrated with your Contrail platform over the Junos V app engine. as an example, and we're starting to see trials of that framework occur. The mobile packet core, you could argue that that has been made, some functions have been made hypervisor based. So the mobile MME, the Mobility Management Entity for Hotspot 2.0 is a function. I believe you had a partnership with Hitachi on that, which is the former Nortel MME code base. We're starting to see examples of that. One could argue the CDN and Akamai, they say they're already SDN based. They may not be OpenFlow based, but they've already decoupled the control plane from the video data plane, and they have a whole distributed architecture. One could argue that Google Inside is pretty much an SDN example. So we're starting to see cases of that. DPI, deep packet inspection. I mean, do we need to trombone to a dedicated box to inspect every packet, or can we make that a la carte? And so we're starting to see some of the algorithms that are in a deep packet inspection appliance now being virtualized in the cloud for traffic shaping. So we're starting to see more and more voice over IP. I mentioned the session border controller, the IMS core from, let's say, Alcatel-Lucent or a Nokia Siemens, that's already now running on server farms. And for VoLTE, voice over LTE, once it gets launched, we're going to see that as an example. So we're starting to see some examples already occur in the telco world.
I'll just give one joint customer with both Rackspace and Juniper, actually, on the East Coast, a very large financial services company. We did a custom Neutron plugin for them that uses MVRP. So they like VLANs, they know VLANs, they want to use VLANs, but they don't ever want to configure top of rack. And that's open source, it's available for OpenStack, but we've made no push really to get it into core, because again, you have to be a certain kind of customer, certain kind of company to be happy with VLANs as your basic model.
That's one of the first or only installations of MVRP that I have come across.
Juniper did a patch to their...
Juniper did a patch to Junos to support it, actually, because it's UNI and not ONI. Yeah.
So for traction, I'd like to talk about how the business is going. Our public cloud, which is based on OpenStack, it's a $300 million business annually, just crossed that threshold, and it's growing 10% a quarter. So most of, a big portion of that is our OpenStack-based public cloud. And what else are we seeing happen? I know there's a lot of entrepreneurs in the room. One of the things that we track, we have a startup program, which targets the Y Combinators, the Techstars, the Imagine K-12s, the 500 startups, all the other proven accelerators out there. And one of the things we look at is, if class is 10 people, what percentage of that class, or 10 companies, what percentage are we getting? And across all of those, we see between 10 and 50% are adopting some Rackspace product, often either a public cloud or a private cloud. And in our public cloud specifically, I think this is a good example of what we're seeing in terms of the ability for a customer to leverage OpenStack. So if you take a company like Pantheon, which does, I don't know if any of you guys know what they do, but they do basically Drupal as a service. So you manage and deploy Drupal websites. They have companies like New Republic on their platform. They are running hundreds of cloud instances, and they have an operations team of 2, which is pretty impressive. I mean, that is game-changing business model for an early stage company. And then on the, I don't know if we're talking about the same customer, but on the private cloud and hybrid deployment, 2 of the customers that we've talked about pretty extensively out in the open are CERN, which is obviously doing some really, really innovative stuff over in Europe around nuclear research, and Fidelity. I'm not sure if that's what you were talking about. What both those companies are doing, I mean, first of all, the traction is real. There's no doubt about it. The conversation has moved from Eucalyptus versus CloudStack versus OpenStack to OpenStack versus VMware versus AWS. There's no doubt about that. But what these customers are doing in a private or hybrid environment is using our software to run on their servers on-prem, on customer prem, and bursting to our public cloud. And that is, it's pretty compelling for a lot of customers. And so that's what we're seeing.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna open up the panel here for questions from the audience. As you can see, with the healthy debate that we have had, I mean, there is a lot of opportunity here to continue shaping the future of where this whole movement heads. But let me open it up. Any questions for the panelists from the audience?
So where do you guys see AWS evolving towards? Is it going to be always public? Is it going to be hybrid? Is it going to be private? What's your perspective?
I don't represent a big company, so I won't get in trouble by answering this question, whereas these guys will get in trouble. I do a set of predictions every year, and so my annual set of predictions came out this morning. I did not include Amazon in them this year. They arguably are now in the private cloud business with the one they're doing for the CIA. I mean, if you're only doing one private cloud, but it's a $600 million private cloud, you're kind of in that market. So in that sense,
I think Jeff Bezos came out and said that in a
Yes.
Wall Street Journal interview, right?
Yes,
So,
he did.
Yeah.
Which I think, unfortunately, is bad news for eucalyptus, because otherwise maybe they could get bought by Amazon. I don't think they will ever do the kind of private cloud that Rackspace does, in the sense of in a customer's data center. I think Amazon is too married to their own operational model, so I think they will dedicate hardware, and in some cases an entire facility, but I think they will own and operate the facility. That's my hunch.
It's a very
Handicap.
different business model, running your own large cloud based on infrastructure and bandwidth, where you're running on the margin, right? You have that set of networking infrastructure for the rest of your properties, and that's how it started. And you have the massive economies of scale and operations. Trying to coalesce that, bring that into private is not as easy to do, if you will, to package it and bring that into an organization. So going from public to private, not as clear. On the other hand, going to enterprise, use of the cloud is obviously something that they're going to spend a lot of time and energy on. On the other hand, they're at a very fast pace of innovation, one new product or service a month, and trying to bring in enterprise services into their public cloud is probably more likely the outcome than them trying to come into so-called private clouds. VMware ourselves, we've spent a lot of energy on private clouds and extending that experience to hybrid clouds and working with our partners like Rackspace and Terramark and Savvis and companies like Colt, etc. So we're coming at it from two different angles.
I think, listen, I'm biased, obviously. But I think that what you will see is, in many ways, Amazon is a do-it-yourself service. And we at Rackspace are a hold your hand proactively and reactively through the experience. And I think what will happen is Amazon and Google, the Goliaths of the market, will really duke it out. I mean, you saw GCE come out the other day, and you're seeing price cuts, and it's competitive. It's uber competitive in the DIY cloud market. And I think where we will aim to go is continued differentiation on service levels. The CERN story that I told, the Fidelity type story that I told, and the operational leverage that a startup can get through us, and the service level that we give them.
I'll add one other angle, which is the question you didn't ask, but I think you could have asked, is how does OpenStack beat Amazon? Right? Which is something I tend to think about, although I don't think of Amazon as being the enemy in any particular sense. I think for the OpenStack community, it's important to see OpenStack succeed. And if someone's either going to choose Rackspace or they're going to choose an Amazon, I selfishly would like them to choose Rackspace. Because it means later when they need a private cloud, they'll buy my software. But the thing that OpenStack has that Amazon will never have is a community. And if you look at the history of their relationship with the folks who built on their platform early on, RightScale is a great example. I can't think of a single example of a company that did well by trusting Amazon as a platform to build on. in the sense of Amazon has gone ahead and copied the features that their quote-unquote partners demonstrated were valuable, like a GUI dashboard on top of the APIs. And I think we hopefully will see in 2014, we'll see the tools ecosystem start to take advantage of the OpenStack platform in a way that Amazon will never be able to compete with. We'll be able to surface things that folks know they can get from any OpenStack environment. When you see Fog and Bodo and RightScale and Stracious and Dynamic Ops and Service Mesh start to surface features in OpenStack that you can't get from Amazon simply because Amazon is only a single vendor, I think Bezos will say something else in the Wall Street Journal and it'll have a short word in it.
Akshay, you want to
Yeah,
add something?
if I may add, so we're also seeing the Verizon Terramarks and the telco clouds jump in as well. And so, you saw Project George, which is Verizon Terramarks Me Too play on a price per CPU or storage element kind of basis to compete with Amazon, but then try to upsell with the fact that they do resiliency on demand or bandwidth on demand. So they own the pipe as well, with Verizon's wireline network. So you're going to see the telcos try to differentiate with an end-to-end, service level agreement type approach that bundles the network as a resource with storage and compute all as one atomic transaction.
And I think that there is a difference between what your business model is. Is it to build a product or is it to build a service? And I think Amazon has built everything as a service. And Rackspace, IBM, and even VMware. The business model is to build a product, and it's not easy to transition from one to the other.
Any other questions from the audience?
I was just going back to the fundamentals, and Alvin and everybody else on the panel has represented this, but I'm curious about the state of the art overall. We talk about SDN and SDI as being very much enabled for everything, compute, storage, networking. So I'm trying to understand the golden process today, or state of the art, which has truly done a remarkable job of really providing SDI all throughout all these layers, like layer 7 to 2, and so forth. So I'm just trying to understand, has it truly been already invented with whether it's Open Daylight, OpenStack, or Federation of SDNs, or what have you? Is this truly here, or is it still an evolving picture which is imperfect in a lot of ways, and therefore it requires services to set it up, therefore it requires buying from Rackspace or Juniper's products or Cisco's products or IBM's products, as you call it, rather than services? Where is all this happening? Is this truly here, or we are still evolving? And the second part of the question is, who's really making money in the SDN space? Rackspace is competing heavily with AWS and so forth. Is really money being made in these?
Let me take a crack at it. We talked a lot today about OpenStack and its alternatives, but VMware spent a lot of time and energy on exactly this issue. I think we introduced the term software-defined data center, and to back that up, about last year we introduced vCloud Suites. Just so you know, vCloud Suites is ramping up faster than even vSphere, which I think after Windows is the single most successful software launch ever. So vCloud Suites within its first quarter to be already $100 million per quarter, 200, 300, including compute and networking and security and storage, all the way from L2 to L7. In fact, recently we had a very large deployment, 60,000 VMs, private cloud in an enterprise. You can't talk about it. There are places like GE and Citi, which were on stage at VMworld talking publicly about this. That's more the private cloud scenario versus the open stack-based scenario, which we're also participating in at eBase and companies like that. So it is here and now. NFV, we're talking about it. We got a full soup to nuts L2 to L7 stack. One of the reasons why VMware has gone ahead, I think someone alluded to this earlier, Josh, that we've gone into the business of building up our own service because it is hard. It's not easy to take network operators of these silos and these different organizations and service providers are set up with network engineering and network operations, and it's just not set up the right way. So we're doing it. We're going to build a hybrid service. We've launched that service, and we're going to take those learnings and make that available to our partners. And I think private cloud is very far ahead of where public clouds are today. Public clouds standing naked VMs in the cloud. Amazon has done a great job for the Facebook wannabes. It's a great product, but it does not meet the need for enterprises. And I think, as the folks at Rackspace would say, some of the most successful, profitable parts of SDI in the business is enterprise workloads. People are willing to pay the price, for that capability. So I think it's here and now. And like someone said, they're going to have alternatives. You'll have an open alternative, you'll have the public alternative, you'll have the private alternative. And we believe the reason why SDI and SDI is taking off in a big way is because it's compelling, much like server virtualization was incredibly compelling, etc. Unless you're a Facebook or a Google who have your own stateless apps to worry about, most organizations are not that way. They have apps from the 80s and the 90s, and so they can't cover that. And it is a profitable, very profitable business. In fact, we're going to think we're going to grow to the $10 billion mark based on the back of vCloud Suites, which has been successful.
And vCloud Suites enables you all the way in the enterprise from
storage,
security.
Yeah, storage, networking, security, compute, and management. And then we'll grease the tracks for private to hybrid too.
Akshay, you wanted to say
Yeah,
something?
and to add to that, who's making money? You could argue that the original investors and the original engineers at Nicira with 1.3 billion from VMware made money. The Insemi folks, 840 million from Cisco, they've made some money. And then the Contrail folks, I think they all pocketed 50 to 100 million. So I think they made some money too.
So that would be a good, sort of like on the money angle, since we are on that point. For the customers, you mentioned vCloud Suites, you mentioned OpenStack. For the customer, you're building a product in terms of the Rackspace, using it as a product and providing a service. But from the customer point of view, what are they best aligned towards? Like, of course, I'm hearing Alvin say vCloud Suites is the best way to go about it on the private side.
Just to be fair.
One,
I'm biased.
Okay, so given the scenario from the customer perspective, what are the best advantageous way to go about cost-wise to go with an OpenStack type of an approach, using the public cloud ways of doing it, and doing bursty traffic using, like you said, the public cloud, and having a private cloud of their own? What is the best sort of approach in this way to slice through the cost equation?
I'll take a quick stab and then let Matt close it out, because again, we don't do hybrid, we just do the private side. I think VMware's perspective tends to be about one set of buyers and one set of use cases. And those, the folks who are buying vCloud Suites are doing it because they bought vSphere and vCloud before that, and there's a VMware sales guy who's re-upping them into a new product. They care about legacy applications because those are the applications they were running on vSphere, and that's what they're moving into. We almost never compete with VMware because we mostly sell to folks who are building greenfield, next generation web scale applications in large enterprise, but with a totally different model. And I would tend to say I don't think layers 2 through 7 are done. If they were done, I would be less busy. But we have a strong partnership with, ironically, what used to be VMware and is now Pivotal around Cloud Foundry. We find for a lot of folks in the customers we serve in the DevOps world, they're skipping a lot of SDI. They don't need 100% of SDI to work in order to run PaaS. If PaaS is what they really need and that's what they're getting to, there's a whole bunch of other problems that go away. You don't need a lot of self-service APIs around some of your layer 5, 6, 7 functionality if it's built into your PaaS platform. And so I think the cheapest way, the ROI question here, you have to understand, we identify 6 different primary use cases for private cloud. You need to know which one of those use cases you're in to say, okay, well, do I care about having alternate vendors? Because vCloud Suites means you're buying from VMware forever. VMware will also sell you something that has OpenStack APIs on it. So you may still want to buy from VMware as a vendor, but buy a different solution. Because you know you can buy that solution from IBM and HP and Rackspace and Piston and so on. you are going to have to make some decisions about hardware. A lot of what people think they're getting out of cloud is the ability to use commodity hardware, which means Quanta and ZT Pro and Supermicro, and not, no offense, System X or 360s or whatever. You have to decide if your organization will survive changing your vendors and changing your operational model and going, oh, are we going to freak out every time a server fails? Because they're going to fail in a different way. We need to not care. We need to have an operational model where we don't care. The biggest stumbling block with a lot of this, and this comes back to this, is it a product or do I need services to help me deploy it? Even if you're buying my product, and arguably with no humility at all, we have the most turnkey solution. I can stand you up in OpenStack Cloud in 5 minutes. You still need services because you still have to train your staff what to do next. You still have to deal with cultural change management. You still have to do with the fact that the ROI in deploying private cloud is around agility and improving business outcomes. It's not really an IT ROI. This is not really about having cheaper infrastructure. This is about infrastructure that can keep up with an accelerating pace of business. And if you're not ready to have your business go faster, you're wasting money. What are you doing? You're fixing a problem you don't have yet. If you have a problem where your IT can't keep up with business, deploy a cloud. If you're deploying a cloud because you read it in a magazine, it doesn't matter how cheap it is, it's still a waste of money.
So Matt, you have the closing words on this before we wrap up.
So I think that, so it varies dramatically is the easiest way to put this, but I think that most customers that I talk to think about it from a price to performance perspective. And to Josh's point, price is hardware, software, and humans. And so that means either as a service provider, we can, I use Pantheon as an example, but they can leverage our expertise around running very large scale clouds. And so that's a key component. And then, so it's hardware, software, and people. And then as the denominator around performance, I think it's to Josh's point around, is it IOPS? Is it concurrent users? Is it website visits? And that's what our customers are looking to maximize. So a database workload, a lot of times, that's going to be best in a dedicated or bare metal config. That's just the way the world is set. You cannot get the same sort of price performance in the cloud for many database workloads. And so I think that hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah.
So let's see, we have time for one last question here and then we'll wrap up.
Right, shifting gear back to OpenStack. It looks like OpenStack definitely having quite a bit of success. Customer adoptions are slowly happening, a lot of press associated with that. Gartner's research analyst a month ago came out with a pretty detailed, pretty good analysis of where it really stands, what he thinks, and it was not a good message around OpenStack at all. I mean, that's by
Alessandro Pereira.
Yeah. So I would like to ask what your opinion about it, as well as also Hannah's opinion. Is it really true what he feels is happening, or is it different?
It's true that he feels it. That's good. He's Italian. He's not lying.
But Gartner coming on making that statement, that's serious, I thought.
Yeah, so I've read that. In fact, unfortunately, Shri has, I think, left because he's got a flight. We were having a conversation just a few hours ago that definitely is a one man's opinion, and there's counter arguments. So I've also attended the Citrix event, the analyst event in September, where everything was about CloudStack, and the attack on OpenStack that they gave was, oh, this is a bunch of NASA engineers driving things, and they know about the cloud, but they know about stuff, the physical cloud, and going up in space. And so that was their attack was, this is a science project to them, and so Citrix, we're carrier grade, we know about mission criticality, and so I think the jury's still out. Personally, I think we still have to see if with partnerships like IBM and others, VMware and Rackspace and other companies, and Juniper and others, Cisco and others, I think there's ways to make it carrier grade. You don't get carrier grade or enterprise grade 4 nines or 5 nines reliability just because you say it so. It has to be engineered in. And so I think we're starting to get to that production quality type systems.
Very frankly, I don't know how we
So-
can make money out of OpenStack.
So I think the panelists will be around and we can have more conversations one-on-one. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to close out the panel. I thank everyone here for a great, engaging, stimulating discussion. So please join me in thanking the panel.
It's ironic. The year before, Analyst Day, Lydia and Neil wouldn't stop.